Hello everyone, welcome to the Raid Starter Guide. Fair warning, this guide will assume that you have already gotten to champion points 160, and if you're not there yet, don't worry, there's still a lot that you can take away from the video. So we will begin by talking about some basic starter gear that you can wear as soon as you hit 160, and then we'll continue on until the end of the video, where we will discuss how you can begin to dip your toes into learning some of the harder content in the game, such as vet hard modes. So without further ado, let's get into it. So to start, I want to recommend that everyone who is new to raiding begin doing so on a DPS character. There are a lot of reasons for this, but by far the biggest reason is due to cast per minute, or CPM. Since DPS is the easiest role to measure your CPM via a parse dummy, this will serve as the basis of your progression. We will talk a bit about how to track this progression when we go into the combat metrics section of the video, but that's for later on. And since typically tanks and healers are a vital part of clearing trials, I find that it would be much less stressful as a new player to simply play DPS. And while I absolutely encourage everyone to learn all roles, I would expand on the tank and healer roles after you have dipped your toes into raiding as a DPS. And this is because CPM will have much more of a group-wide impact if you are playing on a support role, due to the buff and debuff uptimes, as well as survivability. We can expand on this a bit more later in the video, but for now, let's start by crafting some simple gear that you can wear to begin your raiding journey. The gear I'm going to recommend you start with is on screen now, so we use Order's Wrath along with Tideborn and a 2-piece critical set. The point of this gear is not to do an insane amount of damage, but rather just be a good starting place for you so that you can actually farm the gear that you will be wearing when you get into harder content. And what gear will you be farming? Well, instead of telling you what gear to farm for the current patch, I would like to show you guys how you can figure this out on your own. Since the meta is always changing, there will never be a single correct answer for this. And to keep this video relevant, I need to show you guys how to make a build that will work for the trials that you're interested in, because the only right answer for what gear to wear is, it depends. So, let's start with constants. Constants are a variable that rarely ever change and will typically always be relevant. And the first constant is a 5-piece of trial gear. So any set that has Minor Slayer is a 3-piece bonus in it, such as Onsol, Null Arca, Morris Scribe, Reliquin, and so on. These sets are always going to be a safe bet. And which set to pick will depend on the trial you are doing. So if you are doing a single target heavy trial, such as Sunspire, then sets that do single target damage may be your best choice, such as Null Arca. But if you're doing a trial that requires a lot of AoE damage, then it's possible that another set that applies AoE or flat damage may be better, such as World of the Depths or Onsol. Another constant is an arena weapon. Again, there is no single correct answer for everything, but if you have an arena weapon, then you're probably going in the right direction. Typically, your arena weapon will be backbarred. Maelstrom Inferno and Greatsword have both been pretty safe bets for a while now, so I would recommend farming these and working them into your build. And for the third constant, it's going to be a monster piece or set. So if you're someone who has the ability to farm a mythic item such as Velothi, then you're likely going to want to run your mythic item with a 1-piece monster set that provides critical rate. And if you're someone who does not have the ability to farm a mythic, or maybe you just don't have one yet, then you can wear a 2-piece monster set to try and push out some extra damage. And again, there is no single correct answer on what to farm. I would recommend taking a look at the monster sets and try to understand what they do and how they might be beneficial for you. Because as I've said, everything will depend on what you plan on doing. Zon, Selene's, Maw of the Infernal, all of these are likely good starting points, but again, read into them. The best guide is always your own understanding of what an item or build actually does. And for the fourth constant, we have our second 5-piece set. What should this set be? Well, you guessed it. It depends. This second set will be heavily influenced by what your build is. So if you're a class that benefits greatly from channeled abilities, then Deadly could be a potential option. But of course, there are also some other safe options, such as Tideborn, the crafted set, that simply gives you a flat damage increase. Advancing Yokeda gives you crit rate depending on how many stacks you can build. But for example, if you're an Arcanist with a 5 or 7 second channel beam, then you may struggle keeping your stacks of advancing Yokeda. So these are all things to think about when you're working in your second set. With the build part of this video out of the way, let's move on to what you can do to make sure that you are ready for raids. Every raider needs to have soul gems, food, repair kits, and potions. Without these, I would argue that you are not raid ready. And to go along with potions, it is important to ensure that you have your medicinal use passive from the alchemy crafting skill line. As without this, you may notice that you run into sustain issues during raid. As raiders, we also want to double check that we have all of our relevant passives from our skill lines, such as our weapon and class passives, and even undaunted passives. Although undaunted passives are lower on the totem pole for a raid readiness check, and you can just acquire them as you go. The point is, make sure that if you have skill points available and relevant passives to obtain, that you actually obtain them. Don't forget about them. Also double check that you've got your Mundus Stone buff, such as the Thief Mundus, which has been in the meta for PvE for a long time. So is that it for raid readiness? Well, yes, but no. I would very strongly recommend that everyone install add-ons to help assist them in their journeys with raiding. While they're not absolutely essential, and a good raid lead who is hosting a training run should be able to tell you how to perform all of the mechanics, even without add-ons, we still benefit from using these add-ons as tools. On the screen right now is a list of all the most important add-ons that I would recommend you install if you're looking to get into raids. Ensure that you also install any required libraries that the add-ons may need in order to function properly. You can get these add-ons by using Minion. I'll have a link to download Minion in the description. By far the most important add-on I recommend you get is combat metrics. And let's go ahead and do a deeper dive into combat metrics right now. Hello, Future Wolfie here. So I realized as I was editing that the combat metrics section of the video is quite lengthy. And while there is a lot of good information, and I would still recommend that you watch it if you have the time, I did want to provide a quick TLDR for those of you who may want a summary. So to start, let's pull up combat metrics. And here on the fight stats tab, we can see our debuffs in and our debuffs out. So debuffs in is actually the buffs on herself, and the debuffs out is the debuffs on the enemies. Keep in mind, if you don't have an enemy selected, then this will give you an average across all enemies that may pop up in this window. So you want to make sure to select an enemy so that you can view their specific debuffs. And then in the middle, we can see our crit damage and pen numbers, which are the two most important ones. So max crit damage is 125, and max physical penetration or spell penetration is 18,200. So these are the two numbers that you mainly want to prioritize, and we want to look at effective because that's your average during a fight. Now let's go to the info tab. On the info tab here, we can see our weaving average and then our weapon attacks and our skills. So the weaving average is the main number that you want to look at because the lower that this number is, the more actions per minute you are doing. So this will be your basis of progression and how you track it. And then for the weapon attacks and the skills, you want to make sure to try to make these match. So ideally, this would be 120 to 120 because that ensures I am doing one light attack for every skill cast. So that's the TLDR. But again, if you have the time, I would still recommend watching the combat metrics section of the video because there is a lot of good information there. So let's move on to that section of the video. Okay, let's go into a little bit more depth about combat metrics because this is the add-on that I think will be the most helpful to a lot of people. So I've just killed a few Dune Racers here in Craglorn. So let's pull up our CMX window and let's go over how we can read this. So the top left corner is where we can see the total time in combat, our damage per second, as well as the group damage per second, and then the total damage done by both us, ourselves, and the group. There's some other information here as well, but for the now, the most important information is just the DPS and the total damage. So moving on to the middle window here, we can see that we can determine how much our max sustain was and our stamp sustain was by this right here. So this is our resource return here, and then our resource drain over here on the right. So we can see this is 670 mag recovery per second and 336 stamina recovery per second and 2.9 ultimate recovery per second. And then we can see how much we're actually expending over here as well. So what are these three icons here? So blue is mag, green is stam, and red is, let's just call it HP, right? So if you're a tank, go to red. If you're a stamina DPS, go to green. If you're a mag DPS, go to blue. Or if you're a healer, you can also go to blue as well, because typically they run mag. But you get the idea, right? So whatever your primary resource pool is, that's what I would recommend going. So for us, since we are stamina, we're going to look at the stamina. And we can see what our effective weapon damage is, as well as our max. So what is effective? What is max? Well, effective is what you were averaging throughout the fight. And max is, well, obviously pretty self-explanatory. It's what your max was, right? So throughout that fight, our average physical penetration was 5,666. Our maximum was 7,598. And this is really useful because it'll help you determine what you can optimize in a raid environment, right? So if, let's say we're in trial, right? The maximum penetration that we can have for trial enemies is 18,200. So if we're under that, then we know that we're losing a bit of damage. And it's the same thing with our crit damage as well, right? So since max crit damage is 125%, then we can determine whether or not we can optimize for more crit damage if we're under 125%. And typically, for most people, I would recommend just looking at the effective because that's what it averages, right? So if you're averaging, I don't know, let's say 115% crit damage and not 125, then that could be problematic. That lets you know that you're missing about 10% crit damage throughout the fight on average. And so you could be doing 10% extra crit damage, which is pretty important, right? So that's how you can use that to your advantage. And now let's go ahead and move on to the top right window here, which is the buffs as well as the debuffs. And then we can take a look at some mag and stamina here, but let's not worry about this for now. Let's just look at buffs in and out, right? So buffs in is buffs on yourself. Buffs out is essentially debuffs to the enemies, right? So let's start with buffs. So there's a lot of big buffs here that we need to look out for, right? So Major Berserk is a good one, right? So if you're lacking Major Berserk, then you're losing about 20% damage, which is not good. So typically, a lot of DPSs will run something like Inspired Scholarship, for example, or Igneous Weapons from the main tank or something like that, right? So you want to make sure that you have Major Brutality and as well as Major Savagery. Major Savagery comes from things like the Relentless Focus or the Fighters Guild Camo Hunters, things like that, right? So this is where you can track all your buffs, essentially. This is important to keep in mind. Don't worry about too much about what specific buffs you need or anything like that. Just for now, this is how you read it. And then now let's take a look at the debuffs, right, on the enemies. So we can see over here, let's hop to the bottom left here. We can see on the bottom left, we have 3 enemies. If we do not have one highlighted and we click on the debuffs, this is not super helpful for us because we don't know what each enemy's debuffs were, right? This is more of like an average between all the enemies. So how do you know a certain enemy got the debuffs that they were supposed to get? Well, you don't, not from this window. You have to actually click on the enemy that you want to look at. So let's click on the first Dune Racer here. And you can see that the debuffs changed, right? So this first Dune Racer had 60% major breach, right? Which is a pretty important one. This is how you get physical penetration. Or both physical and spell penetration technically, but let's look at physical penetration. So major breach is a big component of that, right? So we can see that our effective was 5k and our max was 7.5. So essentially, and that's largely due to the major breach here. So that's why these two numbers are different. If this was 100%, then you would probably see that the effective is closer to the max, which makes sense. That's how it should be. So if we click on the next enemy, we can see that, yeah, so right here is a good example, right? So 99% uptime on major breach, and you can see that the effective pen is equivalent to our max, which makes sense because we had 100% uptime on their major breach. So again, this is how you can use CMX to be to help optimize your setups, right? So like if your setup is missing like a form of minor force, for example, then that's 10% crit damage that you're missing. And if you're 10% below the cap, then maybe you should slot something that has minor force on it, like Barbed Trap, for example. These are just things to think about, right? So on the bottom right window, we don't really need to go over this too much, but it does give you some useful information, right? So you can see like what your most damaging abilities were. So typically if they're higher up on here, then it may be a better idea to prioritize just more, prioritize those skills a bit more, right? So for example, my Relentless Focus, which is my bow proc, is doing the most damage, right? So whenever I cast it, it's doing an average of 23,000 damage. So whenever I have bow proc up, it's probably a good idea to use it, right? Because it does a lot of damage. And then, you know, so on and so forth, right? So Incinerate, Blockade of Fire, stuff like this. That's not always true, but that's just a good baseline for a new player to rating. That's how I would sort of start approaching it. Okay, so that's the fight stats, or the fight stats tab. So let's move on to the next tab that I might recommend looking at, which is the graph. So you can see here, it'll give you a DPS graph. Don't worry too much about this, right? Like it's nice, sure, but we don't need to worry about that. What we do want to worry about is here. So over on the left, if you click any of these like dashes here next to the colors, you can change what it's tracking here. So let's go to resources, stamina. So in this fight, you can see your stamina, right? So like I can see that I was pretty much topped up on stamina the entire time throughout this fight. So I'm good on sustain there. However, you may find that the reason that this is useful is because if you're in a trial and you notice that your sustain is really bad, you can add it into here and see like how bad was it, right? Like, do you need to adjust for something? Do you need like a different food? Anything like that, right? So if we do the same thing here with my mag, we can see that my stamina sustain was fine, but my mag was kind of suffering a bit, right? So maybe I need a little bit more mag sustain. So this is why the graph window is helpful. And you can do other things, right? With ultimate, or, you know, your average spell crits or spell damage, stuff like this. There's a lot here, but for now, let's keep it simple with the resources, and so that you can prioritize your sustain and stuff like that. And let's move on to the info tab. So here's where you can see what gear you're wearing, what skills you have on your bars, what CP you have, all of this, right? It gives you a lot of information. And so it'll also give you your Mundus Stone and what potions you're using, as well as if you're using any poisons or anything like that. It'll be here. So the main thing I want you guys to focus on as a new player to rating is the weaving average, as well as these weapon and skills here. So if we look at this specific fight, we can see that my weaving average was 0.229. And this is the total time wasted here. So 3.442 seconds. So, and this was over a fight time of 20 seconds, right? So we can see that I could have saved in that 20 seconds, 3.4 seconds. You can kind of imagine this as I was standing in place doing nothing for 3.4 seconds. I could have been casting skills or, you know, anything, right? So this is a fat waste of time. Ideally, your weaving average would be as low as possible. That's really the goal of this, right? So if you're parsing on a dummy and then you pull up your CMX, this is a good number to look at here is your weaving average. Like you want to make that as low as you possibly can. And then as far as the weapon attacks and the skills, you always want these to be equal, right? So if they're equal, that means that you're doing a good job at light attack skill, which is kind of how the combat works in this game, right? You want a light attack skill. It's called your weave, right? So this is good here. 16 and 16 is good. And the reason that the light attacks are so incredibly important, by the way, is because it does a lot of things. Like if you're not wearing Velothi, then your light attacks do a lot of damage. And even if you are wearing Velothi, light attacking is important for if you're wearing like Relentless Focus on your bar or something like that. Something that builds stacks so that you can use your bow proc, right? Yeah, because it procs off of light and heavy attacks. It generates a stack of Relentless Focus. And as we saw earlier in the fight stats tab, this is my main damaging ability, right? For me. Obviously, this will change build to build, but you get the point. So always try to make sure that your light attacks are the same as your skills. And then over here on the right, we can see our CP, right? So if you're coming from a raid and you realize after, like you saved your fight or something like that, and you realize after, like, oh, wait, I didn't have, I don't know, Exploiter on. But then you go and look at the fight stats and you see that the enemy has off balance over here. And there's no off balance on this enemy, but let's just say that the off balance was 34% or something like that, something high, 33%. Then you could benefit from Exploiter, which increases your damage done to off-balance enemies by 2% per stage, which, you know, is 10% if it's maxed out. So you could benefit from that, right? Like, these are things that you want to keep track of. Like, what are you missing? This is how you check, right? Always check. So your champion points should be in line with all of your stats here. So crit damage, your buffs, uptimes, all this good stuff, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that's everything I wanted to discuss with combat metrics. There's some obviously some more things that we could check out here. Like there's more tabs here, like healing done, damage received, healing received, stuff like this. But for now, this is what I'm going to focus on. I think this is a good starting place for a lot of people. So hopefully this helps. And let's go ahead and move on to the next section of the video. So now that you have a good understanding of combat metrics and how it can help you improve, where do you go to find raids in the first place? Well, if you're looking to get started with normal trials, then Group Finder will be just fine for this. Normal trials pose very little threat, even to new players. So if you're trying to get your first trial set, then I would recommend just joining some normal trials in Group Finder. But if you're someone who's ready to get into veteran trial content, then I am going to strongly recommend that you join training runs via ESO rating discords. You will often find that the best raid leads will be hanging out in Discord raiding servers, and there's a very good reason for this. It's just easy to set up and schedule runs in Discord. I myself own my own raiding Discord and will encourage you all to join in on the fun. But even aside from my own, there are some pretty good Discord options which I will link in the description. Many of these servers will be partnered, and joining even one of them will grant you access to multiple. So find whichever server works best for you. Alright, so now that you've made it this far in the video, let's go ahead and do a quick summary on everything we just went over. So first, when you hit CP 160, make the starting raid gear that you will use to farm your first real set of trial gear, such as no Arca. Second, you will then join normal trials in Group Finder to obtain said gear. And as you are doing this, you can also farm for things like your arena weapons, mythic items, and monster sets or pieces in parallel with the normal trials that you are doing. Third, make sure that you have food, repair kits, soul gems, and potions before hopping into trials. This is especially important if you're doing veteran content. And also double check that you have all relevant skill line passives, like the ones for your armor weight and your weapon passives. And fourth, while not absolutely required, it is strongly recommended to install add-ons for raiding. And fifth, track your progress with your cast per minute by parsing on the dummy and use CMX to check what your weaving average was. If you don't have CMX, then just simply improving your DPS on the dummy is typically a good indicator that your CPM is also improving, especially if you are wearing the same gear. And finally, to begin learning the harder content in the game, such as vet or vet hard mode trials, I recommend joining raiding discords. And I will have a few of them linked in the description below. So that's it. Hopefully this guide was helpful, and if it was, please leave a like or a comment to let me know. And also, feel free to share the video with anyone who you think may be interested in raiding. And if you have any further questions or do you just want to hang out, you can feel free to join me on Twitch as well as Discord. I will leave a link to both in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and take care.